all the time, Austin, that before the internet, there was still weird mimetic stuff that were
Yeah.
like people who went to different schools in different parts of the
Yeah.
country still had like
Same
all the
games,
same
same
weird
urban legends.
games or yeah, exactly. Um, Unclear how that stuff
In
travels. I
Australia. No,
assume
in Australia too. My wife and I talk about shit that we're like, did you do that at 10 years old? It's like, yeah, like why? How? Did it travel in the newspaper?
a lot of it is stuff that was on TV or was in a movie, or there's a lot of stuff that gets snuck onto records, like when in the 90s when hip hop really blew up, there were so many skits and, bits of personality that were kind of tucked in between songs and stuff like that. And when I listen back to old hip hop
Mm.
records, you're kind of like, "Oh, that the first time anyone ever said that?" Or
Yeah, 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 yeah,
like
yeah.
and and so I do think it's probably one of those things of I always think of like the Super Bowl commercials as being the original memes. Like we would get one big delivery of memes per year, and then people would do like the Budweiser was up all year.
What?
Um
Yeah.
yeah,
See,
and
people,
and so I
youngins, they
think
don't
it
know
was just a
about
bunch of
that.
weird things like that, whether it was commercials or TV shows or records or whatever it is. But for whatever reason, there's always that stuff that ended up being like really sticky in a weird way. I don't really know how it
Dude,
circulated, but
commercials, they're not as powerful as they used to be. Because do you remember? I mean, maybe it's just 'cause- like, remember Bud, Wise, the frogs? And then
yeah,
do you remember, and now this might even be before your time, youngins, Spuds McKenzie.
Spuds
Do you
McKenzie.
guys every time I see a bull terrier walking down the street, I have to tell my wife, I'm like, babe, Spuds McKenzie was I wanted one of those dogs as a little boy because of the commercials. And then, of course, that was like the problem, right? It made drinking look real
Well,
cool to like
yeah,
5-year-olds.
that's the thing. You say
And
commercials
Joe
used to be more
Joe Camel
powerful or
smoking
whatever.
cigarettes.
Yeah, I was just about to bring up our good friend Joe Camel, that I think it's twofold. One, that there's not really any monoculture anymore, whereas like I think that's why Super Bowl commercials are still a thing, is because like that is the one show every year that people do watch live in a year or en masse. The other thing too is that I think people are just a lot more savvy and cynical about advertising, so
Yeah.
it's a lot more difficult to kind of sneak that stuff in, because I think people have their hackles up for. Also,
Mm.
I don't know if because there are tons of laws about like cigarettes can't have commercials anymore. I know. I think alcohol commercials, you're not allowed to drink the alcohol on screen in the commercial. I wouldn't be surprised if there's
You
also
can look
some
really
rules about
cool
like
hosting a
you.
party where yeah.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if there are also some rules about like you can't do like an animated alcohol commercial, or you can't have like a like cutesy mascots. Or like I don't know, I'm just speculating, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are some more regulations on stuff like that where they had to shit can Spuds
This is
McKenzie.
just this is just fucking Hays Code shit, but by another name, right? Because so here's the question: so you watch
Eh,
a commercial, you watch a
I think
commercial that's
I think
regulated. You
there's
can't have
yeah. Go ahead.
no, but it's still there. Like it's like yeah, you can't show people drinking, but you can show like a bunch of hot people partying together. And what you're saying is,
Well,
hey,
it's
drink our beer, and you're gonna fuck like rabbits, and you're all gonna have fun, and everything's gonna be great. It's the same fucking
there's
thing.
also, because the drinking age is 21. I think you legally have to be 25 to be in a drinking commercial, or to be in an alcohol commercial. I know that the age to be in an alcohol commercial is a few years older than the drinking age,
In
basically
Australia, it's
because
14. They want 14-year-olds in their commercials because they want to get. No, I'm kidding.
well, I don't know. Like you could
No,
tell me
no, I'm
fucking
just kidding.
anything about
I'm just.
Australia, and I'd be like, yeah, that sounds right.
That was a joke about how much they drink in Australia.
But it's one of those things where, because commercial agents and agencies are always trying to get like the youngest looking people imaginable, that I think they did have to raise the age of people in alcohol commercials just to try and like knocks out 21-year-olds who look 18, essentially. Um,
Ah, that makes sense. It's so
because
funny.
I remember hearing someone I was working with telling a friend of mine who was an actor who looks really young. He was like, "You're gonna get tons of alcohol commercials when you're 25." Like, I just remember that just got lodged into my brain because she's one of those people who's like perennial 16. She's like 4'6" and 80 pounds, and I just remember him being like, "Oh yeah, you're gonna book a
They're
ton
gonna
of
eat
beer
you up. Yeah.
commercials." Yeah.
It's so funny because I remember growing up, and you'd have to tell me I haven't seen booze commercials in the States for a while because I haven't been around. And then whenever I do visit, we don't watch a lot of TV. So, but growing up, it was always like, the Coors Light commercial was like the Coors Light fridge that opens up and it makes the party cool, or like the train comes in and it's like a hot summer day and it makes it all cool.
Sure.
And everyone was, they're like in bikinis, but now they're, in like fucking snow bunny outfits or whatever. But it was always very sexualized, right? And then remember there was that, what was the fucking, was it Burger King that was like
Carl's
eating the
Jr.,
Whopper? And it was, yeah,
the
yeah, Carl's
sexy
Jr.
ad.
was like,
Yeah.
yeah, those in Australia, and I don't know if it's just maybe it's parallel as well in the States, but in Australia, most of those similar kinds of commercials are all about like friendship now. So like the drinking commercials are always like, bros driving in their pickup truck, going out into going camping, but they bring their fucking tuies with them or whatever it is. It's much more like friend community, barbecue, party, go to the game, watch the footy with your friends, that kind of thing, rather than where at least the commercials that I remember in the States were much more sexualized.
Yeah, I am probably not the right person to ask about this because I don't watch TV, so the only commercials I ever see are YouTube, and only then I see like the first 5 seconds, and it's.
To be fair,
Um,
nobody watches TV and most of them only see commercials on YouTube.
Again, that's why, as you say, whatever your grievance is, that commercials used to have more power or whatever. I'm like, I think they might have just had more attention and more money put into them. The other thing too, and we've talked about this before, that I think is so funny is that because ad agencies are wise to how wise people are, the sort of house style for commercials now is either like really weirdly earnest or the complete opposite of like the Flow commercials for Progressive, where like their whole thing is like, oh, everyone who works here is stupid.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
just weird stuff like that where you're like, what? I don't understand how this is a compelling sales point that like, oh, all of our representatives are complete buffoons.
Eh, I-
But that
But
I
but
think
you're
is a
but you're
response
right.
to audiences getting more savvy.
Exactly. And I remember it was funny. It'd be interesting to think about this. So one of Wisecrack's favorite theorists from back in the day, Slavoj Žižek, who obviously riffs on kind of like pop cultural phenomena and tries to like maybe squeeze too much out of them. But he talked about commercials back in the, and this is before Zizek popped and became popular to like millennials and shit. It was he was talking about commercials and he was like, well, look, if you actually look at how commercials have changed, they don't sell the product anymore. Like you're selling a car, right? You don't sell, oh, it goes to 0 to 60 in X amount of seconds and it gets this gas mileage. You used to do that maybe in like the 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe even into the 80s.
Eh,
Now then it switched to, then it was much more about like, oh, like this is the lifestyle that it will give you, right? Like if you do this, you can be free and you can go out into the woods and you can go fishing and camping and it'll make you free. And then it shifted again where it's just like Matthew McConaughey in a Lincoln Town Car, just like waxing poetic and looking hot and pensive and whatever else. And it's like, wait, what are they selling now? Are they selling a vibe? And now it's
I
just like
think maybe
vibes.
you could argue that now, especially with high grade consumer items like fancy cars or whatever, they're selling status more than anything. Like that's the gist that I get from Matthew McConaughey
Mm.
kind of purring his way through whatever car ads he sells. Um
Well, he was the Lincoln lawyer, so I'm pretty sure it's a Lincoln, right?
if I'm sure I maybe I don't know if there's that much synergy between 10-year-old Matthew McConaughey movies but I don't know. I don't know what cars he sells. But I do know that I've sat down in a movie theater before and I've seen a car ad with him doing his thing on the
Yeah.
voiceover. So like I know what you're talking about. I'm not 100%. Anyway, welcome to Show Me the Meaning,
The end.
Wisecracks movie podcast. Today's the last episode again. And we don't have anything planned. I guess we do. We were gonna do some emails, some Q&A, some things of that nature. But this this is it. Really going
Yep.
out with a whimper this time around. But if you like this and you like the show and you're going to miss us, we're going to do the best we can to give you a good send off. If you don't like this, good news. It's almost over. You don't have to put up with this anymore.
Well, let's do this. Okay. So we'll get into some mailbag stuff. Listen, I've got a hard out at 12:15 local time here, so that's an hour and 15 minutes. I gotta get on a call, right?
Ooh, boy.
Because
I
I'm
wish I
not.
hadn't promised the listeners that we would go a little long on this final episode. But
So
okay, sure.
I might have to jump. So maybe you and Henry can wrap things up. But because I'm not getting paid from Wisecrack anymore, I gotta go try to make some fucking money. Okay, so I got a meeting that I gotta get on. But
Fair enough.
So here's the thing. Let's do this. Let's talk about. How about we do, Henry? What do you think about this?
I'm
How about we
packing up my
spend?
desk during this whole episode. For some reason, I have to move now that the show's
Yeah, well,
over.
we're moving as well. So we're in the middle of moving as well. So apparently,
That's actually
everything
a
is.
studio that Raymond is in. It's not an actual apartment.
Yeah,
This whole thing
Wisecrack has been running this
kayfabe.
place.
Fucking hell. Let's do this. Henry, maybe we can talk for 15, 20 minutes, something like that.
Okay.
And then we'll get into the mailbag. And maybe we just talk about like stuff that matters to us in film. Like why did we get into film in the first place? And why does it even fucking matter that we talk about movies in the way that we try to talk about them here?
Okay.
I've talked a little bit about my origin story, but I'll share it again because I think I felt so lost when I was first watching like when I was watching them like as an adult. Like as a kid, like I grew up. My stepdad, I forgot about this the other day. I was on a walk with my wife and I was like, you know what? Like not only did I love kids prior to this, but like so my mom and my stepdad got together when I was around like 5, 6, no, like 6 or 7, sorry, 6 or 7. And then like we moved in together, probably when I was like somewhere in like the 8, 9, 10 range or something like that. Well, he was going back to school to get his master's degree. And while he was doing that, he was working nights as a manager at Blockbuster Video. The amount of Friday nights that I would spend just walking through the halls as a 10 and 11-year-old while he was in grad school, just walking up and down the aisles, looking at movies. He would just bring movies home, like like those are kind of like formative moments for me that I think I've forgotten, when I think about like my narrative and how I got into film and things like that. Like it's just one of those other components to fit into the whole thing. But like as an adult, like I remember looking at people who would analyze film from like a philosophical or like a cultural or a media theory lens. And I was like, I just don't get it because I don't see movies in that way. And I had to really work at it. So I think there's something interesting in kind of talking about like why we love movies, what we love about movies, how have we learned to watch movies, what are we trying to get out of movies? You can talk with other people and they get completely different things out of movies that aren't even on the same fucking wavelength as you. But I think that's something that's really interesting. So I figured maybe we just take a few minutes and talk about that. And maybe we start with Henry, go to Raymond, and then if I've got anything else to add, then I'll kind of jump in at the end.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. This is a question I have for both of you as far as this goes. Not necessarily the movie that got you interested in like making movies in the sense like, oh, I can do this, or seeing a movie, but what was the first movie that just arrested you in an artistic sense? It maybe necessarily wasn't the one that made you go like, I'm going to make movies, but it made you go like, oh, movies are cool. Less the I'm going to do this in my life, and more just like this thing has a power over me. I'll just bring up real shortly that for me it was probably Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More. The way that presented the West in a much more hostile and violent way than a lot of like the John Ford, John Wayne hagiography of the same, of the earlier eras. Like, it was the first time I found a Western that was old, but it felt dangerous in a way. Also, just being from West Texas, the landscape was very like harsh, and it resonated in a way a lot of like the westerns from like Central Texas or like maybe up in Montana or Colorado. Just it was too green, or maybe it was too manifest destiny minded in a way where this was just like, no, this is a harsh and contested land. So I don't know, for a few dollars more, just really really struck me as what you can do tonally, and sort of the way it ages better to me than a lot of other types of Western is kind of.
How old were you?
I want to say I was maybe 14.
Yeah. And you
That
do you think that when you thought about this from, as a 14, you're just on that cusp of having adult sensibilities, but you're still a child, kind of? Do you think that it was much more of like a wow, I'm sucked into this world, or do you think even you saw the craftsmanship in it, but you maybe at like a really like
A,
germinal
a bit
level?
of both. I think it was kind of the recognition of like the intentional craft of. I mean, we say spaghetti western, Sergio Leone. The Good, Bad, and the Ugly comes to mind with the score, the steel string guitars, the Civil War imagery. But for a few dollars more, to me, was just like the way it painted the desert is kind of hostile, and the way it kind of through the spaghetti westerns, we kind of re-examined the West in popular cinema. It became much more violent. It became a bit more cynical. And being from a place that's a bit more kind of cynical and modern and in the desert, it felt more. I don't know. It hit closer to a reality to me than anything. Again, hagiographic about like the great American mythic West that like John Wayne and John Ford were doing. I had seen old movies prior, and they were just kind of old movies. But this one, despite being old, felt alive or more vivid.
I'm always fond of noting that For a Few Dollars More, which came out in 1965, was 1 year prior to Howard Hawks's El Dorado, which is one of those
Wow.
things where, like, yeah, it feels. And then El Dorado was 66, and Once Upon a Time in the West, my favorite Leone, was 68.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
those Leone films feel
They
like
feel
they're
like they're the
10
'80s.
years.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? They feel like they're
Yeah.
at least a decade ahead
I mean,
of El Dorado.
Once
It's the
Once
same
Upon a Time
thing.
in the West is fresh. I just saw it a few months back. I was
Best
like,
movie ever. So good.
it is
yeah.
amazing.
The same
Wow.
thing.
I
The
want
the
to. I just
same
want to
exact
also.
thing with Pete's Dragon. Pete's Dragon came out 6 months after Star Wars and 2 weeks before Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And
Wow.
it feels like they're 50 years apart
Yeah.
when you watch those movies. It's like the episode of Mad Men where Don Draper puts on Revolver by the Beatles and he's just like, I don't get it.
I
Like
feel.
it's
Yeah.
just it's like this you can see the transition in real time. It's
Mm.
like it's kind of how almost like I feel like there's a before and after 2001 A Space Odyssey. Like all science fiction was different from that point on, you know.
And I just want to say, as far as the Leone filmography goes, that Duck You Sucker or A Fistful of Dynamite still feels extremely radical to me, both because it's
That
it's the
that movie's
spaghetti
pretty
west.
transgressive.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
spaghetti western tools, but applied towards the Mexican Revolution, and also the main character's sexuality and the way it's explored throughout the movie is very interesting to me. It is still transgressive in ways that I
Yeah.
wish it wasn't. I wish that was kind of the standard for big epic filmmaking.
Yeah, that one is slept on in a major way. I feel like obviously Once Upon a Time in the West and the Dollars trilogy get a lot of shine. In a filmography, Leone ever made 7 features.
Yeah.
And so those 4 are like the heavy hitters. Once Upon a Time in America is also in that sort of top tier. And then there's Fistful of Dynamite, which gets overlooked just because I think everything else is like Grand Slam, Grand Slam, Grand Slam. Fistful of Dynamite is like solid fucking triple, and no one talks about it.
Well, okay, what about you, Raymond? What's your origin story?
What? Oh, movies? What was the
Yeah,
first
like
The
movie that
movie that was cool.
enraptured me?
yeah, that was
I was not a movie kid. I just sat in my room and read books and did
mm,
collages all day.
mm,
Um, I I was really into art and I was really into books, and the one movie that I watched just nonstop is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which is still
yeah,
probably
yeah,
my
yeah,
favorite movie.
yeah.
And I think we did that near the end of Show Me the Meaning last time because we were just like, yeah, what's everyone's favorite movies? Let's do it. Um, so I watched that movie nonstop. The movie that got me into movie making, though, was, and this is such a cliche for white dudes of a certain age, but was Kill Bill Volume One. Um, I think that was the one where well, not I think, I know that was the one where I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. At like just I think what was so exciting to me about that movie, and there's a much longer story surrounding this that I'll spare everybody. Um, but I was very excited about that movie just because I had never seen anything that was just like, I'm gonna be a western for a scene. Now I'm gonna be a samurai film for a
Mm,
scene, and now I'm revenge. I'm this. I'm that. There's an anime sequence thrown in there, and it was just one of those movies that really embraced that pure cinema ethos. I think it was maybe the first film like that I had ever seen that just sort of approached the art form with no rules and no restrictions. And on top of that was just immensely entertaining and still packed an emotional wallop. Um, so that was the film where I was just like, oh, I had always wanted to be a storyteller because I was just obsessed with folklore and ghost stories from a really young age. Um, but I think that was when I kind of found the vessel that was right for me of just like, oh yeah, I want to use all of those tools. I don't want to just use a pen. Um, but yeah, that was a major one for me.
mm. Yeah, interesting. When I was a kid, like my favorite movies, we've talked about this, I think, on Cinematology and on here a lot, were like Top Gun, Karate Kid, Princess Bride, and then Jurassic Park blew me away just because it was like a whole world that was felt so big. I think it was the bigness of something like that. But if I but I've been thinking about this a lot over the last 10 years, and I think this actually feeds into a lot of like my political and social inclinations as well. I watched T2, Terminator 2, with my aunt when I was like 10 years old, 9 years old. And my aunt was always the one that let me get away with stuff when I would stay with her. Though my parents were not never married, and so they were separated. My dad converted to Christianity and became like super kind of evangelical. He was like a pastor and he's an elder in his church and all that other kind of shit, right? And my mom was kind of more, she's hippie and free and progressive and shit like that. My aunt is it's her sister, right? So, but my dad would always get like annoyed that like my mom and my aunt would let me do certain things that he would have never allowed under when I was with him, but I didn't live with him. I would only go to visit him on the weekends. I saw T2 and I thought like that it was the most like unreal world that you could ever be sucked into. And I was enamored and I was fascinated by some of the sequences and this character and the figure of Arnold Schwarzenegger at that time too. So this would have probably been what year did T2 come out?
That was 91.
Okay, so I saw it
Let me
on
see.
VHS rental, so it was probably 92, 93 that I'm seeing it. So I'm 9 or 10, right? Somewhere in that range. And so staying up at night in my aunt's apartment in Santa Ana, watching this movie, knowing that my dad would not approve, knowing that like the violence and everything like that was something that like wasn't like acceptable in certain circles, and getting off on that, like fucking loving that. And then remembering the backlash of my dad being annoyed at that and me feeling like, oh, like these things have power. Of course, as a 10-year-old or whatever, you don't get that. But like there's something in that, like, oh, you can ruffle some feathers by kind of pissing people
Mm.
off that maybe they're a little, closed-minded or something like that. And I think that kind of that mentality towards film has always stuck with me. So I really am drawn to like elements of transgression in cinema, whether it's really big or whether it's really small. Like T2 is a mainstream film, but it still can be transgressive in certain contexts, right? So like there's
Oh
something
yeah,
about the
he's like
idea of
blowing cops away in that movie,
yeah,
and that, like
dude.
even casting the T-1000, or not casting him as a police, but having him impersonate a police officer and putting this embodiment of evil, like while little dude Edward Furlong is wearing a Public Enemy T-shirt the entire time. Like it's very plugged into that current at that moment.
And I think that kind of like fuck you punk attitude led to a lot of things. We talked about this earlier when I was in my little fucking skate punk band from when I was a teenager into my early 20s, and my real rebellious years came actually when I was in my 20s. That was when I kind of really became more rebellious, and then it got fed fuel, and this goes into like my formative kind of film love. When I was in grad school, both doing undergrad and grad school, but especially grad school, and I saw Tree of Life, the Terrence Malick film. And then I got introduced to the work of John Cassavetes. And I thought two things. When I saw Tree of Life, and this is not true, but when I saw Tree of Life, I was like, oh, wait a second. You mean it's just a guy with a camera and a wide angle lens that's just like following people around? Now, it's obviously there's much more craft that it goes into what he does, because there are many parodies of Malick that don't even come close to what he's doing in a lot of his work, and maybe even some of his later work. To the Wonder might be a Malick parody film.
There's an extent to which some of his work kind of feels like it's verging on self-parody at
Yeah,
times.
but
But I
but
mean,
but the
I don't know.
but,
It's
but
still
the
it's still
idea
entrancing.
I fucking love it. I'm a Malick Homer, and the idea that the camera floats and that there was a simplicity in the craft, and then I started watching Cassavetes films, and it was like, oh, so you can even like improvise, and because I had such a strong theater background, I prioritized the actor more than anything. And so for me, this showed me a way of like bringing the two together where it felt like, oh, so you can have long extended takes, you can have free floating scenes, you can have a camera that isn't locked off, and then the editing tricks and things like that, which I've come to grow to love later in my life. But at this moment, it was really like, oh, so you just need a fucking camera and a story and like a really good script. And if you have someone with a really good artistic eye, you let them fucking handle the visuals, but like you can make some shit. And that was kind of the thing for me. So marry that together with like the transgressive aspect. Like that was, I think those are the things that really kind of formatively kind of kicked me into falling in love with cinema. And then, of course, when I was in grad school, it was films like Tree of Life and Lars von Trier's Melancholia in particular. I remember that people were debating about and arguing about at the time, and trying to see like if we could understand the human experience at a deeper level. And then I was kind of also kind of sucked into that conversation as well. So all of that has kind of led to kind of where I am today, and how I see film and what I get from film, and why I love film.
I also feel like the the trees of life and wings of desires of the world, those movies are films that, like, even if you weren't a movie guy, would still probably be movies that spoke to you personally. Like
Mm.
your other interests, your other pursuits, your history as a philosopher and as an academic. I feel like
Mm.
there's a lot of sort of soul stirring, more poetic, that kind of tonal stuff that would have just naturally sort of embedded itself in you even if you weren't seeking it out. Like I feel like those are, if you weren't, let me put it this way, if you weren't into making movies and an actor and what have, if you weren't an artist at all, you would still read like The Atlantic. You'd still be the kind of
Yeah,
person
yeah,
who's, got a coffee table
yeah,
with books on it.
yeah,
Things like
100%.
that. And who is excited, oh yes, why, oh, there's a retrospective at the blah 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 blah. I always hear stories
That's
about
most of
like,
my colleagues from academia were those people, and you're like, "Wait,
yeah,
are they
exactly.
real?" Yeah, 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 yeah. The people that
Yeah, and
run the
not that there's
philosophy and
anything.
film departments and stuff like that, yeah.
And yeah, that, like, it's the difference between Woody Allen and a Woody Allen character is just like his characters just aren't
What is it? Jason
filmmakers.
Schwartzman? Jason Schwartzman later? Is that yeah or whatever? Yeah, exactly.
Sure, yeah, but there's still a sort
There's
of
a dozen
like,
of them.
yeah, exactly. There is a sense that you get of like, oh yeah, you could just take the filmmaker part out of your DNA and you would still essentially be the same person.
Yeah, I can see that. What about, let me ask you this, Raymond. What about, kind of following up on Henry's question, what about as an adult? Is there a film going experience, or did someone introduce you to a filmmaker that made you not say I can make this, but kind of like
Mm.
where you were like, wow, like that's my muse kind of thing, or
Hmm.
was there something
One
like
of
that?
those people always talk about how when they saw there's always like two movies. There's the movie I went and saw Star Wars when I was a
Yeah,
kid and I
exactly.
knew I wanted to make movies, and then I saw Clerks as a young adult and I realized I could.
Yes,
That
yes.
is the origin story of a bunch
If
of
you watch
filmmakers.
Film Courage on YouTube, that's pretty much every interview with a Gen X filmmaker.
Sure. Maybe I'm trying to think if there was. I didn't really have, at least not one that is at the front of my brain the way that Kill Bill was like, oh, that's what I'm gonna do, and I just was like, I just decided to do it. Um, I don't really have one that was like, and this is the movie that gave me permission. I will say, Night of the Living Dead is a formative film
Mhm.
for me. Like that's top five material for me. That's a movie that I think, as much as any, is probably one that encouraged me to like, yeah, pick up the camera, do it yourself. And that's one of the things that I love so much about that film is that so much of its origin story is like not only that it created a genre, but in some ways it kind of created a movement, not just in
Mhm.
horror films or zombies or whatever, but it's kind of impossible to imagine what indie film would look like today without the influences of George Romero and John Cassavetes. Um, those guys, obviously Romero being a bit more genre oriented, a lot more genre oriented. But yeah, that's a movie that definitely speaks to me as like that and Carnival of Souls, the Herc Harvey film, of like some of the first guys to ever just be like, well, I have access to a camera and a farmhouse or whatever, so
Mhm.
I guess I'll try this out. Like, that was not even independent films back then were still so cost prohibitive. It
Mhm.
it really is kind of like today when I watch Night of the Living Dead, I still think it retains 100% of its vitality because you can kind of feel the grittiness of it. You can feel that sort of shoestring, sort of
That's
handmade quality
yeah.
to it.
It's
That
very
that that's
efficiently
another.
made.
Go ahead, Henry.
Oh,
Oh,
just
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
brilliantly
oh,
edited. Yeah.
yeah.
I was gonna say that also people who have come into my life have been so important. Like when I was living in the UK doing grad school, and I was still doing some acting quite a bit, and it was mostly in theater, but I'd be auditioning for TV and film and whatnot, and I met a filmmaker. We've talked about him on the podcast. I think he's been a guest, Keir Seward, who basically introduced me to how you can like his job was he was just a filmmaker. Like he didn't have another job. And I was like, well, how does he fucking survive? And he would make music videos for local bands, or he would
Mhm.
do like little corporate gigs if he had to. But most of the time he was making music videos. And like every weekend he was filming a music video. And he would shoot and direct and edit and light all himself. And we would rent a bar, and you wouldn't even have to pay for the bar. We'd go to like this bar called the Flying Duck in Glasgow that was, it was a bar, so they weren't open at 9 o'clock on a fucking Tuesday or whatever. And we'd be like, hey, can we come in for 2 hours and shoot? And we'd get 12 friends, 10 friends, 5 friends, and we'd make it look like a crowded bar with clever lighting and sound mixing. But he would run everything, and I was like, oh, so like you can make shit. And it started with him actually hiring me in this little micro budget feature that he did. And then it turned into like me learning how to actually run a set and make shit. And I think those kinds of experiences were so formative to me because I was like, oh, if you can be a slashy, if you can direct, shoot, and edit, if you can do that kind of stuff, You can use natural light. You can get your friends to help you make stuff. And I was like, that was the first time that I was like, oh, you don't have to just write your spec and hope that you get the meeting, and then someone's going to probably option that spec, and they're going to figure out a way to write you out of the contract anyway. And then by the time the project actually goes to air, you might get a developed by credit, or something like that. But like, you got to pay your dues so that you can eventually be fucking executive producer or created by in the next one. Like, I was like, oh, you can just make shit, and you can make a full fucking movie, like full features. And I was like, what? Not just short films. We made tons of short films too, but like full fucking movies. And I think not only did we have the community and the collaboration of people that we loved, and then we would get other people to buy in. Like, a BAFTA-winning cinematographer named Alan McLaughlin would come in, and he would shoot a couple of our things because he loved us and he loved the project. And it was like, then you're like, oh, and then they want to help you make something, and then you want to pay them back. And when you do have money in a budget, you fucking call them and you're like, hey, dude, guess what? We've actually got money for this one now. You want to come fucking make one? So, but it was that kind of thing. And so it's good people who kind of show you the ropes and who introduce you to something, but also like just making shit with your friends. And I think that was amazing to me. And that kind of goes to what you were talking about, Raymond, where you're like, oh, like, we've got a barn and we've got a camera. Can we make something? And I think there's something so amazing about that I think that was like, for me, like a scales falling off the eyes kind of
Yeah.
experience. And I didn't realize it at the time because it felt so like duh. But now when I talk to people who have not had that experience or who don't think in that way, I'm like, wait, but it's just so obvious. You just got to spend 4 or 5 years just making whatever with your buddies, and then you know how to fucking make
Yeah.
movies,
Well, it is one of those things where for so long that was logistically and economically just an impossibility. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to suggest that it's not anymore. For a lot of people, like, it, making any movie is still such a commitment. I'm the same way, where I have a great group of friends out here. We're, all multidisciplinary. We're all helping each other out on projects all the time. But even then, after, God, I've been out here for over a decade. And after over a decade of favor swapping on short films and things like that, it starts to get to a point where, like, no one puts up a fight. Nobody says no. Nobody says, like, oh, I'm not going to come. I'd really prefer to get paid and da 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 da. But you just start getting to a point where you just don't want to ask your friends for another favor. You want to be able to pay, and like, you kind of just hope that this was the
Well,
bargain
no,
I made with
my narrative
myself.
is a
That
20s narrative. When you're in your 20s, you do what I'm talking about. Once
I
you
was
get into
just
your
I was just
30s,
about to say that. I was just about to say that I kind of made the deal with myself that, like, I would just work nonstop through my 20s, and hopefully by my 30s I would have some benefit of that. And fortunately, it did work out for me to the extent that
yeah,
it's worked out. Like, I became a professional screenwriter in 2019 and started booking gigs. I was 29, and then the pandemic hit, and it slowed my career down, a little bit. Um, but I was just one of the really lucky ones that, like, the plan worked out. But I say that, like, oh, I made this bargain with myself that I would just burn myself out through the 20s, and then, blah 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 blah. But, like, I wasn't gonna do anything else with that decade of my life. I wasn't gonna, like, go backpacking through Europe, or, like, I was just gonna sit in my apartment and read and write anyway. Like, that's just what
yeah,
I
yeah.
enjoy doing. Um, so it's just one of those things where I think I will say there are a lot of sacrifices that I made, though, of, like, I used to play several musical instruments. I used to do improv and stand-up comedy. Like, I used to do a lot of things that I just basically said, okay, I can't I have to do this one thing. I want to do
Mhm.
one thing really, really well. I don't want to do a bunch of things half-assedly. And, it was worth it to make that sacrifice, at least in my opinion. But I also I don't begrudge anyone, or judge anyone for wanting to live, like, maybe a slightly more balanced life than I did for the past 20 years, which was
Yeah.
a very alienating experience at times. But I don't know. I just I feel like the sacrifices that I made were worth it, but also like they might not have been. There without there is a I can trace every domino that led me to the point where I was getting paid to make movies. Like I can see them all in my head and be like, oh, there are several times when I almost went left instead of right, and
Mm.
I would probably still be floundering around right now if it weren't for like, you know, A, having a few lucky breaks, and B, having good judgment when I encountered them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mm.
Do we have
I
any cues? Do we have anything in the
was gonna
mailbag,
say,
or well,
We
yeah.
yeah.
have some mailbag. Also, someone in the chat was asking if either of y'all had opinions on the Roadhouse remake.
I got about 5 minutes into it, and I turned it off not because I was like disgusted. Roadhouse is one of my favorite movies, the Rowdy Harrington with Patrick Swayze. One of my favorite movies, and that remake was simmering for a long time. Um, and I do intend to watch it eventually. I wasn't like, oh, I can't watch this. They're shitting on I don't care about that. Like, whatever. Um, I turned it off because I was with a group of friends, and we were all kind of like we were just sort of enjoying each other's company, and then we put the movie on because we were like, oh yeah, let's check that out. And then the conversation we were having right before we pressed play continued to develop, so we just shut it off, and I haven't given it another chance yet. But no, I haven't seen it all the way through. But I like Jake Gyllenhaal. I love Jessica Williams, who I think has a probably not a huge role in it, but I always like seeing her pop up and stuff.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it, and I just it didn't interest me. When I was a little boy, I think my mom instilled in me that Patrick Swayze is like peak masculinity, and so for some reason, I was like, listen, I love Jake Gyllenhaal, but I was like, but I already have the Patrick Swayze version. I'm good for now. And maybe at some point, if it were on TV, I would. This is absolutely one of those ones where if I'm like flipping through our network down here, Foxtel, and it's on one of the movie channels, 100% I would watch it. But I didn't have any real pull to try to go out and watch it.
I can recommend, if you're looking for a streaming movie, I just mentioned Jessica Williams, check out The Incredible Jessica James, which is like an indie rom-com that she stars in. Really breezy. It's like 80 minutes, streaming on Netflix, and I think it's very easy to overlook rom-com or even just comedic performances generally, but it's one of those movies that you watch and you're like, how is this woman not one of the biggest stars on the face of the earth? Like, she's just so extraordinarily charming in that film, and a lot of other stuff that she's done. But I think that as a star vehicle is a really, really good movie. Check it out.
Okay, cool. Well, let's get into some questions, Henry.
Cool.
Yes,
Should
let's
I
get into
just
some
go
questions.
down the dock?
15 minutes before Austin has to leave.
Yeah, we have some
I know.
long ones. We have some short ones. What are you feeling?
Yeah, whatever. Just throw one at us.
Okay, here's one I'm going to throw at you. It's a question on headcanon from Matthew Rodert. Hey, show me the meaning. There's a fan theory that Tony Scott's 1998 Enemy of the State is a backdoor sequel to Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 The Conversation. It isn't. The claim's based on similarities between the characters played by the late Gene Hackman. How productive are headcanon sequels? Are they just a trite observation, or could they say something interesting on a thematic level? Scott's more frenetic style eerily portends the energy of a jingoistic war on terror. Thanks for all the episodes, Matthew.
Thank you for listening, Matthew. Matthew writes in all the time. He listens every week. He's one of those show me the meaning and cinemathology. He's sent in some emails over there, and I know that we've interacted with him a few times on the air. So thank you so much for your support, Matthew. It means the world to us. Headcanon movies where the things are seen as unofficial sequels. Are there other? I'm trying to think of another example of that. I know there are a bunch of them that people say like, oh,
yeah, I'm like freezing up at the
this
moment,
is
but I
kinda
know
like
I have some. Yeah.
Yeah, right. A quasi sequel.
There's
to
like
that
The
or
Rock
whatever.
as a sequel to the Connery James Bond stuff.
Mm.
Yeah, Mason in
The
The Rock was James Bond. The fairies in The Dark Knight had the detonator from their own bomb. The
the
slasher
one that
movies all
comes to
exist in the
mind
same universe.
eh, the one that comes to mind for me is 1985 saw the release of both Breakfast Club and St. Elmo's Fire, which
Yeah, yeah.
feature like 3 members of the Breakfast Club are in St. Elmo's Fire, which is if you're listening to this, I'm sure you've seen Breakfast Club and probably St. Elmo's Fire, but Breakfast Club, group of high school kids in school detention, whatever. And then 3 members of the Breakfast Club are in St. Elmo's Fire, which is about a group of friends who just graduated college. And it feels, even though they came out like months apart from each other, it's a movie that feels like it's commenting on the Breakfast Club in a way. Like that film, it feels like it should have been made 4 or 5 years after the Breakfast Club, as sort of like a kind of curdled perspective of what happened to these kids after they had this what seemed like a life-changing day, but ultimately sort of just kind of faded into the effluent of adolescence or post-adolescence. Um, and I'll also say I think The Breakfast Club is not as great as its reputation might be, but I still love it. Like I have a big soft spot for that one. Whereas St. Elmo's Fire is one of the most heinous fucking movies I've ever seen. It's terrible, and everyone in it is a terrible person, like to the one, with the exception of there's maybe like 1 or 2 characters in it where you're like, oh yeah, cut Ali Sheedy some slack or whatever. But the rest of the characters in it are like really awful people, and there's not a single moment in the film where you are like charmed or won over by them. They're all just these fucking anus dinks, and by the end of it, when stuff is oh yeah, they're having their come to Jesus moment and blah blah blah, you're just kind of like, oh my god, just get this fucking over with.
Dude Abides in the
But
chat brings up
that's
that
one that
all the
comes to
Shermer
mind.
movies take place in Illinois.
What was that?
Just Dude
Uh,
Abides bringing up in the super chat that all the Shermer movies happening in the Illinois. One that does come to mind as well is Unforgiven, although that one's pretty intentionally playing with the Clint Eastwood iconography.
yeah, yeah.
Oh sure, yeah.
I got this one, Mary Poppins. So this one, Mary Poppins is a Time Lord, and her bag is her TARDIS.
What is it? Oh, so
Doctor Who.
she's a
Doctor
Doctor
Who.
Who doctor. Okay, so
Time
so that's ridiculous. Let's get but
Yeah,
to answer
yeah. I think going back to
So,
like, is
to
this
answer-
productive?
yeah, to answer Matthew's question, no, clearly. Like we just had the least stimulating 5 minutes of any episode we've ever done. But I think it's an interesting question in or the end of his question, he kind of brought up the notion of like contrasting things sort of formally. Are there certain examples of that are instructive? I think, yeah, in some ways you can definitely see the influence of X on filmmaker Y. And that's always fun when you can kind of when you can kind of breathe that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, I can't off the top of my head, I can't think of a lot of other examples. Maybe if the chat lights up with a few, shout them out. But I can't think of many others that are like, oh, this is a natural sequel to that, or seems like a prequel or a setup to this, that, or the other. But I know there are plenty of examples of that out there. But I think that can be instructive, at least from like a formal perspective, like who each respective director's influences were and how they might be commenting on stuff intentionally. I think Unforgiven is a good example of that. Of like, I think Clint held on to the rights to that book for like over a decade, so that he could age into that role, in a way that was very kind of cannily commenting on his own star persona. But yeah, I can't think of another example off the top of my head, but I'm sure there is something worth interrogating there. But the game of like, all the Pixar movies take place in the same world.
Yeah,
Mary
yeah,
Poppins
yeah.
is a Doctor
Shut the
Who.
fuck
What
up.
does that mean?
Shut the fuck up.
Okay, next question. A Western question from Carson Bolt. Mailbag question for you guys. What would you consider to be the essential Westerns? I've only ever seen The
Before
Searchers,
Mm.
McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and the remake of 3:10 to Yuma. So what would you guys recommend for someone who's just getting into Westerns? Gonna miss the show
before
again. Much love, and I look forward to the comeback of Cinemythology. Special thanks to Henry for keeping the show on the rails.
before we answer this question, Carson is a listener of Cinemythology, and I have a long-running email exchange with him. And Carson, if you're listening to this, apologies that I kind of fell off the face of the earth over the past half a year while I was getting ready for the movie and all that. Carson did a Night of the Living Dead inspired short film that is currently on YouTube. If you
Oh,
Google
that's
Carson
right.
Bolt Night of the Living Dead, he and I pinged back and forth, and I had the privilege of offering some notes here and there on his short, but he and his friends they did the damn thing. They shot it on film. They went out, made something that was inspired by one of the great indie horror films, and Carson, that's great shit, man. Like I watched it, I checked it out. It's got a lot of character, a lot of texture, some really lovely material in there, some great looking stuff, and more than anything, it really captures that independent spirit. And so, if you guys have a spare 10 minutes, check out Carson's Night of the Living Dead short there on YouTube. That was a really really cool thing that he shared with me. But apologies. Go ahead, Austin. You're Mr. Western. What do you got, brother?
Well, I mean, there's the classic westerns, the Shanes and fucking Stagecoach and shit like that. I think The Searchers is the greatest. Yeah, the Searchers is the greatest western of all time. If you're going to talk about just like a straight western, I think it's one of my favorite films of all time. Real quick, Raymond, your camera's frozen. Is it frozen for me too? For everybody else?
Can you?
Oh, okay, great. It's just frozen on my end. I think The Searchers is the greatest Western of all time. I think it is difficult in some really interesting ways, and I think the central thematic about the man of violence who has to build society but can't actually live in the civilization that he builds is foundational to a really interesting way of understanding the myth of the West. And whether that person is a hero or a villain is, I think, something that the film kind of forces you to wrestle with. Then, if you're going to talk about like post westerns or neo westerns or postmodern westerns or whatever, then you start getting into like the Unforgivens. I think the spaghetti westerns, they're in like a third space altogether because they are kind of like critiques of the West from the perspective of a foreigner who sometimes you need to understand an outside perspective of your own culture to actually understand your culture. Sometimes you're just too fucking close to the story, right? And then also there's something about like heightening the mythology that you get with a Leone that takes the idea of the Western to a completely different height that totally creates the caricatures, that totally creates a fantastic world. And I mean that in the sense of fantasy. And so I think they kind of occupy a third space. And then, yeah, I think Unforgiven. Hey, you know what? I'm gonna say one that I think is actually really fucking. It's a western, but it's a Marvel film, and it's I think the best Marvel film that's been made is Logan. Um, I think that Logan is a really good movie, and I think that it is absolutely. I mean, I'm not talking about like films that are like properly western or prestige films.
It does reference Shane. I mean,
it
more than
references
reference, it
Yeah, they're
features
like
it.
watching
Yeah.
it on TV in the hotel, I think.
It
Yeah.
references Shane. She, when he's dying, she like uses the same line that the little boy uses when Shane's riding off. You know, when Logan is dying at the end.
Yeah,
So
she yells,
I think it's
Shane!
a.
The
um.
classic line.
So it's there's some really interesting things there. Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I think that every film is a western. So we could kind of talk about
yes.
that. This is why this is
Your
why a
famous
ghost
opinion on this.
story. This is why a ghost
Yeah, right.
story is a great western.
So I have I'll rattle off a few here. Of course, Once Upon a Time in the West, I mentioned before. That's one of my favorite movies, and it's from my favorite year in cinema history, 1968, best year ever. For movies, some other stuff might not be great. Um, Once Upon a Time in the West, I love. I will also. I just pulled up a list of a bunch of westerns, and I was just scrolling here so I could kind of jog my memory a little bit. I'm a big Stagecoach head. That's the big one for me from John Ford.
Mm, mm, mm.
More so than the Searchers kind of lags in the middle for me. And then
Hot take.
a few more. Johnny Guitar. You seen that one, Austin?
I have not.
Yes.
Are.
Johnny Guitar is this great fucking movie by Nicholas Ray, who did Rebel Without a Cause and They Live by Night. Stars Sterling Hayden, Joan Crawford.
Wow.
The movie's so fucking good. It starts as like a chamber drama. Like the first half of the movie is all in one saloon while they're sort of kind of reckoning with the past and what their memories are dredging up and all this stuff. And then the movie just kind of evolves from there. Kind of reminds me of Akira Kurosawa's High and Low, the way that like the movie sort of zooms out and zooms out and zooms out. A recent one, which I adore, The Writer, directed by Chloe Zhao.
Yeah.
Extraordinary film. The Great Silence, directed by Sergio Corbucci, the other great Sergio. And I would also shout out what was the other one I was just about to say? Good grief. Oh,
Newer
Track
or
of the
older?
Cat with Robert Mitchum, really great snowbound western. Cutthroats 9, another really great snowbound western. And then one that I am always beating the drum for that no one ever talks about is William Fraker's Monty Walsh with Lee Marvin. This is a movie about Lee Marvin as a kind of aging rustler or cowboy. And the movie is kind of like tonally, it's, a little bit laid back. It's kind of a hangout movie, a sort of end of the West movie. Times are changing. There's not as much work for these kind of guys anymore, and certainly as they start to age. And there is an extraordinary set piece in the film where there is a very ornery bronco that nobody can break, and they have him in this pen, and Monty Walsh decides like this is his last fucking right. He's like, I am gonna break that thing. I'm gonna prove that I still got it. And I won't spoil it, but his attempt to break the horse, it just goes on and on and on, and is just this like extraordinary, agonizing, beautiful set piece. And then unfortunately the movie has to keep going after that. Like it kind of climaxes with that set piece, and then all the the bad guy all that stuff has to be wrapped up. So the movie feels like it has sort of a weird fourth act. And I always wish that you could kind of like jostle the scenes in the edit a little bit so that it could kind of climax with the horse breaking. But be that as it may, phenomenal movie and legitimately one of the best sequences in any Western that I've ever seen.
Awesome.
And
Real quick, before we switch, I just
I'm a-
got to give a shout out. Sam Peckinpah films, right?
Yes.
So
Oh, yeah.
I didn't mention Peckinpah, but when I think of the post-Western, like I think of Peckinpah's films as being like maybe like that first generation of the post-Western. They're still working within the Western, but they're kind of pushing it into a different range until you get to something like The Writer by Chloe Zhao. That's like a true, what I would call like deconstruction of the Western in like the purest sense. But Peckinpah is like that second generation. He's still doing kind of the classic Western, but there's also something different. Obviously, we've talked about, I'm a big defender of the Ballad of Cable Hogue as being kind of like my favorite of them because I think there's some interesting thematic things going on there. But obviously, Wild Bunch, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is great. The fucking Major Dundee, Ride the High Country, like they're all fucking great. But for my money, the Ballad of Cable Hogue is a really interesting, I would say, post-Western or neo-Western.
I'm going to.
It will also.
I
was going to shout out two more real quick.
Go ahead. I'm going to speed run after you.
Terror in a Texas Town. Speaking of Sterling Hayden, this is a Lone Ranger who walks into a small town armed with a harpoon. It fucking rules. Sterling Hayden's incredible in it. this is one of those like Austin. This movie is a Western, but it's not really a
It's not a
Western.
Western.
Man with a Shotgun.
Yeah, Man with a
Have you
Shotgun.
seen this one, Austin?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it reminds
Um,
me of It sounds like Man with a Shotgun.
uh, yes, Man with the Shotgun is this incredible Seiyun Suzuki film from 1961. It's basically it's like half Western, half superhero film where the main character's power is that he owns a shotgun, and it's
They did
fucking
like
incredible.
they did what did they do? Hobo with a Shotgun a few years ago. That was like a
Yeah.
Hobo
kinda
with a
rip-off?
Shotgun's a Jason Eisner movie, yeah, that came out in the little boomlet of Grindhouse parodies after Grindhouse.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, Man with a Shotgun, phenomenal Japanese film that is very clearly trading on Western iconography. And then I will also say, I'm a huge Twilight Zone fan. That was the other big thing from my childhood. I'm just obsessed with Twilight Zone. And there's an episode in the first season with Martin Balsam called Mr. Denton on Doomsday. Really great appetizer. Follow that up with Seraphim Falls with Pierce Brosnan and Liam Neeson. They're a phenomenal 1-2 punch that are thematically linked. Give it a look.
All right. I think we talked pretty much every Sergio Leone movie, which I just want to bring that up. And Shane, as definitely do not pass those up. They're foundational texts. As far as John Ford goes, I am not the biggest fan of The Searchers. I think Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is my favorite of his. And I do want to
Oh, that's
say
good.
definitely check out Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And then kind of skipping ahead, both as far as like grindhousey Western, but more fun, less kind of a considered mythology. Red Sun from 1971. It is a story about a samurai and a cowboy chasing a French thief. The trio is played by Alain Delon, Toshiro Mifune, and Charles Bronson. It's just a fun kind of exploitive premise. I want to give a shout out to Pale Rider as well, and then last of
Yeah.
all, the assassination
yeah.
of Jesse James by the coward Robert
Yeah.
Ford. Pale Rider is a very interesting remake of Shane by Clint Eastwood, and then the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is just kind of one of the movies about American history for me.
I think that
Pale
might
Rider
be.
kicks
I think
ass.
that might. I think the assassination of Jesse James might be my favorite, like contemporary era, kind of like almost classic Western, but also I think you
Hmm.
can't make a classic Western now. Like I think because we know too much, it will
Mhm.
always have some sort of like deconstruction of the myth. But
S-
A little
but like
passe, yeah.
yeah, but like that film does a really good job of being just like really faithful to like believing the American myth, which also is kind of gross. And I think
Yeah.
there's something beautiful about that.
You
And
bring
I
up
love that's why.
you bring up the deconstruction aspects, and it's interesting because even the book it's based on is an old 1800s book that is exploring how like Jesse James was a myth. There's something kind of postmodern to the Western in recognizing that even like when it was publishing stories in dime magazines and pulp papers in the late 1800s before film was even really part of the deal, like it was like establishing its own tropes and kind of like self-reflections.
Andrew Dominic's Killing Them Softly also
Yes.
has
Great.
if
Yeah.
Jesse James is his classic Western, Killing Them Softly is like his. Well, not that High Noon isn't a classic Western, but it's a bit more deconstructionist and like really confronting how the myth has like sort of buried itself and rotted the firmament of American soil. Really, really good movies.
And out of the frontier and into the city kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. I have
Yeah.
one long one I really want to get through because I think I think I like what it's asking. But
Great, we
here
got all
go.
the time in the
All
world.
right. I wrote the following last week to the regular Wisecrack email address before the live stream yesterday. As someone with in-depth knowledge of this film's historical subject matter, we're talking about The Brutalist here, I really think Raymond's thoughts get close to why I'm having a hard time moving past the filmmaker's use of the subject matter. Was just watching today's live stream. You mentioned you'd be discussing The Brutalist next week. I'm working on my dissertation at Penn in architecture history. A big part of that dissertation concerns some Jewish American architects around Philadelphia, including getting to know the family of one of these figures. I have some thoughts on the movie, some of which are kind of nitpicky, but there's a much larger problem with with the movie specific to the architecture in the time and place depicted. Before seeing it, my grad chair told me I would probably not like it, and that it was basically just the Fountainhead reframed. The idea of the main character as a heroic singular individual against the world is bad. It is not reflective of the actual process of doing architecture in general, but more specifically, most of the Jewish architect expats not only knew each other, but around Philadelphia, they were close friends. They also really believed in community and collaboration in design, even if egos got in the way, and it is clear that part of dealing with this trauma of their displacement was in the maintaining of that community. Besides this, the idea that one person would take one giant project like that on their own is silly on its face and denies what I think would be a far less stupid movie if his ego was more in negotiation with peers, employees, etc. In other words, if he weren't just a ranting hero with a more troubled life. Anyway, I don't know if it's something you'd be interested in, but I would be happy to provide more background sources or discussion if you like in preparation for the episode.
Yeah,
I
interesting.
don't.
Listen, I think I don't disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you've said, and I think to me that's actually precisely why the film is interesting. I think the film is interesting because it's not supposed to be. I think if they had made an historical biographical film, those problems would be more protracted. But I think what they were trying to do, and then maybe this also is what makes the film insidious, which is exactly what he's getting at, is what they're doing is they are creating a myth of the genius, which is the myth of the filmmaker. The whole film is a metaphor for being a filmmaker, right? And it's done through the language of architecture. And so maybe that does a little bit of disservice to the kind of actual network process of how architecture is done, which is it takes a village kind of thing, but also with film, it takes a village. We've talked about that recently. But he's absolutely trying to explore the egomaniacal journey of a singular genius and the struggles and overcoming a sort of situation to try to find oneself and the problems of that, the pitfalls of that, et cetera, all within the context of a culture that can't allow you to succeed no matter what you do, even if you are a genius, because it will always take. And so for me, that's what makes the film interesting, but I can see also what you're talking about. But yeah, go ahead.
I have two responses to this. One is that I hear you on that, and I don't disagree with you with regards to intent, but I also just don't think the movie's an effective version of that. So where you lean in, I lean back a little bit. And secondly, what the heck was I? My other side of it is that to agree with you, I always think of this as a screenwriter, I always think of no character has to represent X demographic or Y occupation. Like the burden of representation should not be solely on the shoulders of an individual character. I always try to think of characters as individuals. I don't try to write when I sit down, oh, how would an architect say this and whatever. Some of that, if you're doing your research, if you're steeped in the language that they're steeped in, that will express itself. But if you are trying to sit down and go, well, time for me to write the definitive version of X, you're setting yourself up for failure. So to that extent, I do agree with you, Austin, that to put the burden of expectation of like, well, this is how everyone else does it, and this is what's typical of this, that, or the other, to put that on one character's shoulders is to deny that character their own agency. However, I don't think the movie does a great job of expressing that, and I also think you could do a good job of contextualizing his sense of individualism within that milieu. I think this is something that I said on my call-in that like I think it is a weird choice in the movie to completely divorce him from his school, his predecessors, the folks from whom he's drawing, and I think a lot of that owes to the fact that like all the people to whom Adrian Brody's character owes a debt of inspiration are the same people that just are an amalgam that created his character. So like you can't really, and that was the thing that kind of bummed me out, is that like I think in some ways Brady Corbett, he sort of painted himself into a corner a little bit, which is that like when you steal so liberally from so many different people's lives, you can no longer put them on the periphery of the story to inform or contextualize this person's journey. It's something that, I don't know if you've ever read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, Phenomenal book, one of the best novels I've ever read. Um, and it's about two guys who, during the golden age of comic books, create a character who kind of rivals Superman, and throughout the book, these two guys are constantly running into other luminaries of early comic books. So it doubles as not only this great novel and fictional story, but it's also kind of like a backdoor history of the art form. And I think that's an example of someone really striking that balance well of drawing inspiration from this era and this art form, but also being able to like position his characters in a way that is unique to the people who may have inspired him. And I think that's missing from The Brutalist, is that like it's kind of it's subtraction by subtraction, that because you're stealing so liberally from so many architects, Adrian Brody kind of ends up having to be a movement of one, because otherwise you would have to wrestle with how liberally that character is stealing from so many other people's legacies. So I felt the same way about Babylon, where like every character in that is so obviously supposed to be like Dorothy Arzner and Clara Bow, where you're just like, okay, well, where are there? Do we see? I can't remember. Do we see real people in Babylon, or is it all just the fake versions of very obviously real inspirations?
Yeah,
I
my
don't know.
assumption
That
was it
stuff-
was mostly fake.
Yeah, that stuff always. I think it's a very thin line to walk that thing when you're making a work of historical fiction. But I do understand what you're saying, Austin. That as a metaphor, I think it's serviceable. But I personally didn't find it all that effective. But I thought that was a great
I will
email. I
say-
would love
Yeah.
shoot me an email over at cinemethologypod@gmail.com if you have some books and some resources, because I would love to read more on that. It's an area and a subject of great interest for me.
Oh,
And one of the things that I think is also really interesting is I similarly, I get my backup when I see like a philosophy professor that's depicted, and it's like
Sure.
the God's not dead kind of guy that's like, you must all sign a thing that's that avows that you are all atheists. I'm like, bro, like
Professor Atheist. Yeah.
who hurt you in undergrad, bro? The writer, like, no professor is ever like that. And
Yeah.
I-
That's
and
not
so
dead.
I
Based
get
on
it.
an email forward. Yeah.
Yeah, but like obviously it's serving a purpose in the larger context of the storytelling. And of course you wish that they would have more fleshed out characters and things like that. But sometimes I think there is something interesting to think like, what is their role in this story to tell this kind of larger mythological tale? And that's where I think there might be some sort of like interest in, I think, how they did it. Because you're absolutely right. Maybe the more interesting story is just the one that Brady Corbet and Mona Fosful didn't tell, which is the one about like a group of immigrants who come together, who then try to figure out how to survive by cloistering together and supporting one another in an environment, in a context that fundamentally is exploitative. That might be the more interesting story, but that's also not how Americans tell stories. Although
it's also
Brady
one of those
Corbett's
things
wife
of,
isn't
like,
American, but yeah.
Credit to the author. You should make the movie you want to make at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But like my response to it is not like, oh, he never should have done that. What a disgrace. My response to it is essentially like, well, I just don't find this quite as interesting.
Also, if you look at Brady Corbet's 3 films that he's made, all of them have to do with kind of like origin stories and like people who are singular individuals, right? So he has some fascination that I think he's trying to work through with this idea of the individual. So there's something interesting in that if you link all 3 of the films together. Yeah.
We all got our thing. All my movies are about hunky podcasters who keep getting canceled. Whose shows keep getting canceled. I think we've gotten canceled.
yeah, they're standout people. It's just Okay, I got another one coming up on Aftersun.
Austin, do you have to go?
Yeah, what are we doing on time?
I
How's
got
everybody feeling?
10 minutes.
Cool. Let's get through
Okay.
this Aftersun one really quick. Hello to Henry,
Henry, if you can stick around after Austin leaves, I can stick around.
I
Let's
can
do it
stick
for
around.
the fans.
Yeah. Hello to anyone reading this. I've been a fan of Wisecrack for years, and I've been enjoying Show Me the Meaning. Since this cycle started, I haven't missed a single episode. I watched After Sun when you announced you were going to do the episode, and the movie was very overwhelming to me. On the one hand, I immediately thought of the theme of crisis of masculinity. I think you can sense it in Caleb's mind and how overwhelmed he feels, specifically on the economic issue. He gets so upset when his daughter loses some of their diving equipment, although he tries to downplay it. He's clearly upset. You can also see his disappointment when he can't buy the rug he liked, although he later buys it. I'm sure it was a big sacrifice on his part. On a more personal note, the final scene with Caleb entering the rave really struck a chord with me. Without going into too much detail, I used to have suicidal thoughts, and the ideal way I thought I'd end things was just going into a club, filling myself with drugs, and letting my body party until everything died down literally. I couldn't help but project myself into that scene. I feel that's what Caleb did, letting out every last drop of life on the dance floor and leaving painlessly, almost without realizing it. I just wanted to share these thoughts. It seems a bit dark for the chat on YouTube. I write under a Swader name. Greetings to everyone.
What was the pseudonym here?
The pseudonym is Comrade That Metal Guy.
Well, comrade, we're so
yeah.
glad that you're still with us. Life is worth living, man, and remember you're never alone. Without getting too dark, I've struggled with a lot of the same stuff, and just recognize there are people who love you. The world is better for your existence. All right, so hang in there, and that goes for everybody.
Makes me
Austin, what
teary-eyed.
were you gonna say, brother?
No, yeah, it makes me really teary-eyed. I think that's one. I think that's actually a really beautiful read on the space in the club, because I heard David Foster Wallace give, I think, maybe like the best interpretation of suicidal ideation that I've heard as somebody who's never dealt with it myself, but I have people that are close to me who have very close to me who have expressed this, or people who I've even lost to suicide. And one of the things that David Foster Wallace said was, he's like, it's like being trapped in a burning building, and the pain just becomes so unbearable that you just need release. So you jump out the burning building. And I think it's very simple and maybe even very intuitive, but I think a lot of people kind of don't understand like how to get their head around it if they haven't dealt with it themselves. And the idea that it's actually like the kindest thing from that perspective, that some people feel like it's the only thing they can do. So then my response is, then let's stop the fucking burning building. Like, how do we stop the burning in the building? Or how do we stop the person from feeling the burning in the building? Of course, that's what we want to do, right? But I think the read on this film, that he went into this room for a type of like annihilation, and then you map that onto, because it's like a void, a space of pure possibility where the identities outside of the room don't adhere onto you. They don't compress upon you with all the burdens and the doubts and the fear. We might call that the burning, right? That stuff is eradicated when you're in that space. And then mapping that onto kind of your thoughts about the party and the release, what you're doing is not only are you going to a space of pure possibility and freedom, but it's the idea of releasing from the suffering. And I think that if we could like reframe these conversations in a way that helped people understand who are maybe outside of that tendency towards experiencing suicidal ideation from firsthand, if we could help people understand in that way, I think that would go a really long way. And that's part of the reason why I love this movie so much, and I think it hurt me so much, is it was like a light for me into like heartache. And I have heartache. I've got this weird, deep existential hole within me. And if I have that, and I've never had depression or suicidal ideation in any sort of like serious sense, not that I haven't had lows, of course I've had lows, but not really, then how much more do other people experience that that are afflicted by these ghosts, these hauntings, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why the film is so beautiful, and not to maybe be overly poetic and overly romantic, but that's why I think films are important and powerful, is because we can come away from it and be affected. And hopefully, comrade, you got affected in a way that was also positive and encouraging, because you could see the struggle, but also come away with it and be like, oh, when you identify it, it helps you to at least maybe get some sort of handle on it. And that's what part of the reason why I think this movie hit me so hard as well. And the conversation that we had with trying to understand that room, that rave party room, I think it's the most inaccessible and opaque part of the film to me. But I think it also is the part of the film that creates the most thought and the most consideration and the most possibility and space for musing. And so, yeah, that's just my thoughts.
To tag that, Roger Ebert famously referred to as film as the empathy machine. I think that's an apt descriptor. It's
Mm.
an art form that is uniquely qualified or uniquely equipped to illuminate the world or illustrate the world through someone else's eyes. Not that other art forms can't do that, but I just think because film represents the confluence of art forms and the sort of cross section of all art forms, I do think it's uniquely well suited to help you experience the world or walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Austin, what's funny is that your experience of the film, you saying that that was the least accessible part of the movie
Mm.
for you,
Yeah.
I had the complete reverse viewing experience of it,
Interesting.
where I found the vast majority of that movie to be not inaccessible necessarily, but I liken the experience to sort of like looking through a window almost of just like, and I don't think this is unintentional, like there is a sort of vignette aspect to the movie where you're just catching glimpses of these people's lives and you're catching these sort of snippets of memories and what have you, and you have to infer so much about Paul Mescal's interior life based on these sort of glimpses that his daughter is kind of half remembering and maybe even enlarging in her mind.
Yeah.
Um, to the point that by the end of the film, where it's operating in a purely expressive mode, that's the moment where it really coalesces to me. And I think that is something that can only be done in this medium where you have, I just think of that needle drop of Under Pressure and the way that the film utilizes the strobing light, the composition, the pacing of the edit, and then also completely drops out the instrumental at a certain point, and it is just
Mm.
like it's hammering you, just knocking on the door over and over and over, like, can you give yourself one more chance? Just like it just keeps fucking thumping you until you're finally just like, I know, I get it, I get it, I get it, I get it. But this is something that I'm always wrestling with as an artist, is that I can't remember who said this, that subtlety's fine as long as you beat him over the head with it. Um, I think it maybe it was Billy Wilder. I'll have to look it up. Um, maybe it was I.A.L. Diamond, Billy Wilder's regular co-screenwriter. I don't know why I'm thinking Wilder. It might be someone else entirely. Um, and I'm always wrestling with that as an artist, that notion of, well, is this too on the nose? Am I spoon feeding the audience? Am I this? Am I that? Blah, blah, blah. But so often when I think about moments in art, not just film, but music, poetry, great oratory, so often it's that just driving, hammering home of something, the plosive of something, like I have a dream, probably the most famous speech any American has ever given and one of the greatest. It's not particularly subtle. Like it's the plosive of I have a dream hitting over and over and over again. It's one of those things where you're like, "Oh yeah, he knew he knew he was on fire." Like, and
That's the
there
Holy
is
Spirit,
something
man.
instructive to that. And I know that that may sound like a reach to compare like one of the great Americans of all time to anything as minor as a movie, but it is one of those things that I do think about of just like, yeah, I don't know. Nobody quotes subtlety. Nobody
Mm.
leaves the theater humming a non-melodic tune, right?
Mm.
It's
Mm.
the bit in Forgetting Sarah Marshall where he's just like, yeah, I don't really get to compose. I just do tones. And you think about all the movies you grew up loving, the theme songs, the theme music that you can whistle or
Mm.
hear in your head that are just as iconic as the images on screen. And perhaps the images are on screen are iconic because of their relationship to the movie. And then you think of all the modern movies that just have tones.
Mm.
And it is one of those things where, like, again, film is uniquely well suited to kind of access something elemental or transcendental
Mm.
just because it's capable of using all those tools of just emptying the clip, as I like to say. And I think that moment in After Sun is something that is like after these long stretches of these like really subtle, graceful, restrained human moments, it's just like, and now we're opening the fucking elevator and the hallway of blood from The Shining is just rushing at you, and you are just going to be hit full force with like every tool in the cinematic toolkit. And I find that accessible on an elemental or essential level, even if it may not be the most explicit scene in the film.
When
Um,
Raymond asked right now
oh,
about,
hey, real quick, I
go
gotta, I
ahead.
gotta run, Henry. I gotta run, guys. I got a meeting that I gotta jump onto. So you guys keep
Love you,
chatting.
man.
Love you too. Thank you, everybody, for coming around for the second 2.0. I just want to say there's possibility that there'll be a 3.0, okay? So let's hold out hope for a 3.0. I love you.
He's not just saying that. There is a distinct possibility,
There
but
is a
we're
distinct
not getting ahead
possibility.
of ourselves.
Yeah. Love y'all. See you on the flip side. Bye.
Love you,
See
brother.
ya. I'm going
Then
to
there were
hop
two.
on, and then there were two. I'm suddenly Raymond, you're suddenly Austin. While I adjust the title, Raymond, did any music pop into your mind when you said theme? I really wanted to ask Austin that before he took off, but alas.
You know what's funny? This is one that comes to mind for me, maybe because I've been itching for a rewatch. I'm sure you've seen It Follows from
Yes.
2014.
Yes.
There was so I went to see this movie in theaters, and there's a great theme in that movie. Like it has a very classical kind of eerie
Mm-hmm.
John Carpenter-esque vibe. A lot of that movie owes a debt of gratitude to John Carpenter. But excuse me, when I first saw the film in theaters, there's a great moment where they're sort of like cresting this ridge and a big building is revealed in the distance that they're going to for this showdown with the ghost or entity or whatever you want to call it. And the score swells and it's that theme. That theme drops as soon as that building is revealed. And I I turned to my girlfriend or my ex and I said kind of under my breath, I was like, "Oh, it's cool that they licensed this for the movie." And she at the end of the film, she asked me like, "What you said they licensed that? What movie is that from?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's from this movie. I'm just an idiot." And despite the fact that I was hearing it for the first time, there was something so familiar about it without sounding totally derivative. Like I said, it has the sort of synthy, the John Carpenter vibe.
Yeah.
But I think I said this on a recent episode that like I do think to some extent a great song always sounds familiar, even if it's the first time you've heard it. That like, and it's maybe just that there was like, oh yeah, that theme just kind of came out firing on all cylinders, and it's perfectly deployed in the film, and it feels familiar but new, which is always such an exciting feeling when you're watching a movie.
Yeah. When you first brought it up, just the RoboCop theme comes storming into my head, stomping like its protagonist.
One
Okay.
there's one that I cannot. So I live in a neighborhood that it has like a park nearby. Really, it's a nice neighborhood. I love where I live. And there is an ice cream truck that makes the rounds every single day. And every single time I see the ice cream truck, I can't help but sing the Assault on Precinct 13 theme. And if you
Ooh, that
haven't seen Assault on
association,
Precinct
yeah.
13, I won't spoil why that's an association. But every time I see the ice cream truck, without even meaning to, I just start. Dum, 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 dum. It again. There's a simplicity to the Carpenter scores that they're such little earworms they get in there.
Yeah, Precinct 13's a movie where just the background, it's you're in a boiling pot the whole time as far as like the way the tension builds and the way the enemy is so
Great movie.
off screen, and that's a great movie. I want to read another email. Before we get too far away from the Western talk, I did just want to shout out something that came to mind as we were talking about the assassination of Jesse James is Richard Slotkin. He's a cultural critic, historian. He wrote a book book called Regeneration Through Violence, which is kind of a history of the American West. Definitely worth checking out if you're a big fan of the genre. He has a whole trilogy,
I'll
but
have to give it a look.
they're all very thick books. Start with Regeneration Through Violence, and if you like that, he has plenty to say. But let's get to this email, because I think it gets to something core at the consumption experience of movies. Would you agree that it's possible to interpret the superficiality in the approach to film media that characterizes parts of our present as results of a primal cultural fear? Today's hegemonic concept of entertainment aims, at least conceptually, at immobility, control, and domination, not only of the consumer, but also of the consumed. Is art here crippled into content and the encounter with it because one is afraid of not being able to deal with what it could become? Or is it the conditions of the present, the competition, the speed of capitalism, the pressure to increase profitability that makes the relationship between man and art impossible? Do we want resonance, but we're not allowed to experience it? Or do we fear, as Sartre calls fears, the existential nausea of encounters with the tree roots and doorknobs? Could the present just have a mortal fear of losing itself within or even falling apart in art? So, did you catch that? I kind of think I have an idea of what's being asked.
Yeah, go ahead. I think I catch the gist of it, but I think it's a big.
Yeah, it seems to be.
I think appropriate for the prompt. It seems to be asking a lot of things.
Conceptually, is art stagnant because we're scared of it not being stagnant, or is it forced to be that way out of a sort of capitalistic, just systemic pressure?
I think the latter.
I do
Here's
too.
the thing. When you talk about is art stagnant because we're afraid of X, Y, or Z, the question there, of course, is who is we?
Yeah.
Right? Film is a team sport, but there's always, hopefully a singular vision that it's working toward. So I find it difficult to make a blanket statement around what is kind of ultimately a team effort toward an individual expression, but I think what they're asking is at the beginning they said like hegemonic art. I assume the Marvels of the world, the sort of big studio stuff.
The hegemonic concept of entertainment. Yes.
That's the what's the rule? I always think to myself, like, anytime that I see a piece of legislation is backed by any corporation, any corporation, I'm like, well, that's not good. That's undoubtedly, there may be some, some rare exemptions, but it's the other thing. Every 2 years when your YouTube profile gets inundated with political ads of this spending bill wants to blah, 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 blah. Make sure you go and vote yes on this bipartisan bill. Anytime I hear bipartisan, fuck off. If a bunch of Republicans are lining up to put their name on it, it does not. I don't give you points for bipartisanship, right? And I think there is something with studio stuff. A lot of the time, this is a good example of this recently is Barbie. That there were a lot of people who were going like, oh, I can't believe Mattel. I think Mattel owns Barbie. Mm-hmm. I can't believe Mattel or Hasbro signed off on this, when it's critical of their brand and the upper office and da-da-da-da-da. It's lightly ribbing the suits.
Right. It's also getting ahead of like someone else calling them out for it, where they're ironically able to cheekily just co-opt and be like, haha, we're aware.
It's a movie that wants to have its cake and eat it too, right? It's about as transgressive as the suits will let you be. Which I guess is not nothing. But again, there's also that part of me where it's like, it maybe feels a little bit cynical the way it's deployed in that film. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a perfect example of what this question is getting at, of like, even in that context, someone wants to kind of like build up some armor and try to sort of critic-proof itself in ways like that. That still feels like it's a reaction to or sort of like a pre-reaction to an overbearing studio or a bunch of studio notes or this, that, or the other. So it's one of those things that is almost you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because if you try to switch things up and go your own way, like you're still going to have a relatively short leash when you're working with
Yeah.
$100 million of some big corporation's money. So I would say it's more that one, but I do think there is something to be said about how works of kind of cynical, or really not even necessarily cynical, because I think a lot of those bigger budget movies, they're not interesting enough to be cynical. They don't really have anything to say, really. Like, it's just one of those things that is it kind of, they're just kind of bleh, they're just sort of there. I do think there is maybe something to be picked apart about the notion of why that appeals to people in a given moment or historical context. People like escapism, sure. But I also think audiences are a lot savvier than most studios give them credit for.
Yes.
I think a lot of what has led to, I won't say Marvel's downfall, because I'm sure they still have some tricks up their sleeve, and their movies are still mostly making money. But I think the reason those movies feel a lot less important now is, A, audiences are savvy enough to know, like, when somebody is spinning their wheels, whereas the first 20 some of those really felt like they were building towards something. It may not have been entirely satisfying for every viewer, but like, I'm not a huge fan of Marvel movies, but I still hung in there through Endgame, because I was like them, love them, dislike them, hate them, whatever your feelings are, those are kind of without precedent. That was a huge accomplishment. And, there may be as many misses as there are hits in that first, Endgame saga, or whatever you want to call it. But there was still something undeniably impressive about them landing the plane. And I think a lot of people were like, okay, they landed the plane. It just reminds me of the end of the Truman Show, when this thing that people have been invested in for like 3 decades finally comes to some conclusion, any conclusion. They just cut to the guys who are in the security, the toll booth, and they just go, all right, what else is on? It's just like,
Yeah.
all right, let's click around.
What's next? Yeah, I
Um,
don't think it's
yeah.
it's much a cultural fear as it is like a cultural attention that's not directed in the same way as it has been historically towards art and artifact. I think it's less a question of like, is the art being crippled, and like where in the place of the everyday kind of citizen art has taken priority or been deprioritized.
Yeah.
Like the Electric State's
I
coming to
read-
mind. I'm morbidly curious about watching it just because of what it is, but I've heard no one talk about it in like the meat space world.
Yeah, it's one of those things again where like that I think is maybe a more interesting conversation of like how the people whose only button was the spectacle button also killed spectacle
Mm-hmm.
just by overuse, perhaps. I'm not sure. I don't know. Like, I haven't seen The Electric State. I'm not really planning on watching it. But it is kind of, and I'm not the first person to make this observation, but it is morbidly fascinating how these movies that are like legitimately, I mean, it's like $250 million if reports are to be believed of how much they spent on that. That like you could just shuffle that into this movie that like no one seems to want or care for or even really notice, I think. And
Yeah.
that is always the biggest, I think the biggest condemnation of any work of art is when someone just doesn't fucking care, of just like, I think Kanye West has reached this point in his artistic journey where it's just like the provocations have become so disgusting and so repetitive and so outlandish that people are now just like, okay, he's putting swastikas on t-shirts. It's just fucking pathetic.
Yeah.
It's not even provocative anymore. It's just like, okay, so I'm officially okay without ever paying attention to you for the rest of my life. And I think there is a little bit of that, superhero fatigue is a word that gets thrown around a lot. I read some time ago that the average film goer sees 6 movies in theaters in a year. And, whatever's coming out, they're going to see 6 of them. And I think there's just a sense that, like, yeah, when movies are made to feel like events, those are probably going to take up the 6 movies per year for your average viewer. And now the event movies don't feel like events anymore. But I wouldn't be surprised if people still, still are inclined to go to that 5 or 6 movies a year. And every once in a while, you still have an indie or a horror
Yeah.
success story that proves that, like, people are interested in not just any old movie, but the experience of going to the theater and having a night out. It's one of the few luxuries people can still afford.
I feel Challengers kind of hit that spot for people in 2024. That was one I actually heard people talking about just out in the world,
Yeah.
out in the real world.
Dune-
But like it had some, Dune as well.
Dune hit big. Yeah. I think there is. I don't know if this is indicative of a broader cultural shift. I think it is, because you're seeing this in music right now as well, where we
Mhm.
went through like a decade of, there are legacy celebrities out there, your Jay-Z's and Beyonce's and Taylor Swift's, but like this really seems like the first time in a while where there are like new pop stars being minted, with Chappell Roan and Sabrina Carpenter, Kali Uchis. There are a lot of like interesting artists who are making really good pop music again. And I think that this is the first time in a while where, like, there's a new generation of movie stars who are very wary of the Marvel machine, of like Timothée Chalamet and Austin Butler and pretty much anyone from Dune. I guess Zendaya and Florence Pugh are in Marvel movies, but they're not like, they don't play the main ladies in those. Like, they still have some free time to go and do other more interesting movies. It feels like the first time in a while where there's a group of stars coming up who are using their cultural cachet to get interesting stuff made, rather than going and squandering their credit and free time making a Marvel movie. And I think that's kind of exciting. I do think that bodes well for the short and medium term future of the industry.
We got a Hitman out of Glenn Powell last year, and that was thoroughly enjoyable.
I still haven't seen. That was another one of those movies that, like, I watched the first 15 minutes and then something suddenly came. I was enjoying it, but I still haven't gone back to restart it yet. I need to.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, definitely seek it out. I think that's it as far as emails go. Anything you'd like to close on, or any questions you have, Raymond?
Anybody in the chat? Any more to shout out?
Let me see.
Yeah, I don't want to leave any questions unanswered on our last show. If there's anybody else out there, this is your last chance. We leave no stone unturned.
Thought I saw one. Give me just a moment. Why is chat being so laggy for me? Sorry, chat. Give me just a moment.
This is going to be so great. After like 2 minutes of dead air, you're going to be like, no more questions.
I saw one that I'm
the
pretty sure
absolute-
was like 3 life-changing
Yeah,
movies
right.
from each of us.
Oh, okay. I was going to say that would be the absolute worst way to go.
Are you
to go
excited for
out.
Andor season 2? I'm gonna ask that one before the other one.
I have not seen the first season of Andor, but I've heard it's very good. I like Tony Gilroy did that, right?
Yes.
I love Michael Clayton, that's for sure. So I'm definitely excited if he makes another Michael Clayton. But I did hear that Andor was good, but I've never watched any of the Star Wars shows. I didn't grow up as like I didn't even watch the original trilogy until I was like 20. So I don't have as much invested in the overall Star Wars universe, but the Andor's the most tempted I've been to watch any of those.
Andor is great. I think it's overdiagnosed as like radical ideologically, when I think it's just good dramaturgically. It's still Star Wars at the end of the day with what it's doing politically, but it's the first time in a long time anything Star Wars wise has had a sense of tension and weight to it. There's no Jedi, there's no magic, so it's just chunkier and better storytelling in that regard. But
this maybe comes back to what we were talking about before, of like corporate art is going to have a very tight leash what you're allowed to get away with.
But yes, Leandro Aruca in the chat was asking top 3 most life-changing films for each of you guys. So do you have a trinity real quick?
Oh boy. What you throw one out? What do you got?
Okay, so I think I'd probably honestly say Night of the Hunter for a few dollars more,
Wow.
and I mean, call it cliche, but I do think Citizen Kane is that good.
It is that good. You know, I so my grandfather, who was also named Raymond Creamer, R.I.P. He worked in advertising during the advent of television. So he was in on the ground floor, and when stars started to do more TV, he was, he was one of the few names in the business. So he met tons of luminaries of that era. My dad still has like an autograph book from when he was little that my grandpa, anytime he would go to meet a famous athlete or movie star, he would always get an autograph from my dad. And he met Orson Welles and had the pleasure of having dinner with him,
Ooh.
and regaled me with a few secondhand stories from the goat. Um, and for years, anytime I would talk movies with my grandfather, he would always end the conversation with, "Well, but the greatest movie of all time is," and then I would have to go Citizen Kane. Or if I said anything else, I would get a very stern talking to. Citizen Kane is that good. That movie's fucking incredible.
Your
I
story
you know
real quick, I just
oh, go ahead.
another book just really came to mind. My Lunches with Orson: Conversations between Henry Jaglom and Orson Welles. Definitely check that book out if you're an Orson Welles head. Henry Jaglom was his producer at the end of his career, and they would have lunches weekly. I forget exactly at which restaurant in LA it was, but he would record their meetings because they're supposed to be like taking notes for like what they're going to be producing after F for Fake.
Yeah.
But most of it ended up just being Orson and Jaglom just pontificating about like social
Just
issues of the
dropping
time,
pearls.
just dropping pearls. And so the book is just a series of excerpts from those recordings, and it's just some of the greatest Orson Welles quotes you can find.
There's also some just S tier shit talking in that book.
Yes.
Where
Oh,
Welles
his
just
takes
goes
on
off.
Woody Allen, my God, brutal.
Yeah, Chaplin catches some strays in that, and that I've never felt more seen than reading Orson Welles' takedown of Charlie Chaplin. I can't stand that fucking twerp.
Yeah, his
Um,
articulations on Reagan, coming from before Reagan was president, are really something I found interesting as well, seeing as I was born after all that happened. And so I have a completely different kind of cultural lens on what Reagan looks like.
I would also recommend, similar to that, if you're interested in sort of just like postcards from a certain era. I'm a huge Harlan Ellison fan,
Hmm.
and he has a book called The Glass Teat, which is like a collection of essays and columns that he wrote, and each of them are dated to when they were published. Um, and it's just a really great. It's not like, if you're not steeped in the history of that era, it can be a little bit like, a different language. But I do think it's kind of fascinating to read a sort of contemporaneous takedown of this gubernatorial candidate, and that politician and that newscaster, and all of it in the like inimitable irascibility of Harlan Ellison, who's one of the all-time great science fiction authors. Um,
Back to your trilogy or
oh,
Trinity.
my holy I probably said it on this episode of like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Formative movie for me as a kid. I think that movie doesn't get enough credit for how resourceful it is,
Mhm.
because people don't realize what a low budget movie it was. It's essentially an independent film produced by the Quaker Oats Company. They hired Mel Stewart for it specifically because he was a documentarian and had experience like, yeah, he can run and gun. He can get a good image and available light. Like, the whole movie was almost like reverse engineered to cost as little money as possible. And when you're a kid, you don't see those seams. You're just so enraptured by like, well, yeah, I mean, like this is what Wonka World looks like. But as an adult, one of the things that I love about that movie, I'm a hyper literal person. It's one of my many shortcomings. Um, and a lot of the time when I'm watching a movie, I have a tendency to just to like engage it face value. And Willy Wonka is one of those films that to me has gotten better the older that I get, and now that I can see the seams, I don't sit there and go like, "Oh wow, this looks like a low budget movie." Now I sit there and I'm like, "God, Wonka's such a fucking dick." He's like he's putting on this stupid half-rent show to scare a bunch of kids into being better people. And like the whole thing to me now just feels like smoke and mirrors of him just like half-assing it and just being like, "Yeah, these fucking rubes will eat up anything."
Yeah, they think they're
And
special.
I think genuinely that makes the movie better for me, that now I read it as just like he's not a magician, he's not even a con man, he's just bored. He's just like, yeah, I'm gonna do this fucking sweepstakes and bring a bunch of kids in and give them the scare of their fucking lives. Like there's just something so perfect about that, and I think it works with Gene Wilder's performance, that he's constantly playing, like he's constantly undercutting the stakes of the film.
Yeah, there's the
When the
whole
parents,
rollout.
yeah, when the parents, yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example of like, I want to go out. That was his idea, to walk with the cane and then do the somersault, because he said from that point on, you'll never know if I'm telling the truth or lying. And the entire rest of the movie, when the parents are freaking out because they think he's murdered their children, he's not underplaying it because he's apathetic or evil. He's underplaying it because he knows they're fine. He's just fucking with these people. He's taking them on a ride. And I just love that. And I love that as I've gotten older, that movie has changed, but not in a way that negates a single moment of it. And I think there's a weird alchemy to that. Willy Wonka, like I said, Kill Bill Volume 1 was the movie that made me say like, oh, I'm going to be a filmmaker. But I don't really know that would be in my trinity now. Buster Keaton's The General, that was something when I saw it, I was just like, this is legitimately more thrilling than half the action movies that come out today. And any Buster Keaton film, you know, his greatest acolyte, of course, is probably Jackie Chan. Watching either of their movies, it's a testament to not only the ingenuity, like the great ideas and creativity that they had as artists, but also just like it's like watching a professional athlete at the top of their game. Just you're just in awe of what a person can do with their body. And Buster Keaton was doing that before any, like, there's a Fatty Arbuckle short where Buster Keaton walks out, they go to the beach, and he goes in, he gets changed into his long one-piece swimming suit, and he just comes out and he kind of like takes a breath of fresh air and then just does a standing back tuck simply because he can. And it's one of those things where you're just like, yeah, people weren't built like that then. The guy was just a physical anomaly. And of course, similar to Jackie Chan, he was a product of like an entire childhood of abuse that just basically sculpted him into marble. For those that don't know, his father, Joe Keaton, who's a, let's say, complicated figure, he, during their touring act, he would bill his son as the indestructible boy, and their entire act was him trying to destroy the indestructible boy. Whatever that's worth,
Whoa.
read into it what you will regarding, child welfare. All that to say, The General was a major film for me. American Movie, I'm sure you've seen that one. If Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is the film I've seen the most times, American Movie is certainly the film that I've rewatched the most times as an adult. I watch it probably at least 2 or 3 times a year. Um, and that's a film that is just so endlessly entertaining to me, not just because its characters are so interesting and so rich, and the dynamics between them are just so lived in and beautiful and compelling, and also kind of like nauseating at points, like how entitled Mark Borchardt is through so much of that film. Um, but the movie is also just a great testament to the creative process and how filmmaking takes a fucking village. You know, it's like I said, it's a team sport. And then God, Night of the Living Dead, another one for me. I'm going way past the trilogy prompt or the Trinity
I
prompt.
know. I want to bring up
Like
Phantom of the Paradise is another huge one. I feel as far as
oh
like how
God,
fun
yeah.
you can have. Yeah, what kind of fun you can have just like with the thing. I do want to
Yeah,
bring up
absolutely.
Lori Christian in the chat was asking if we plan on seeing The Assessment. I have kind of a big backlog of current movies right now.
I just heard it. I don't know anything about this other than it's like in a near future, there's a couple who are meeting with a counselor or something. I just heard about this film. It just kind of crossed my letterboxed feed as like upcoming movies that,
Yeah,
should be
Sam,
on your
I'm
radar or whatever.
not very aware, but thank you for bringing it up, Lori. I'm gonna look into it as well.
I will have to check it out. Yeah. Um, Before we wrap, is there anything you've seen lately? We've talked a lot about some of our old favorites. Is there
I
anything
mean,
that you've seen in recent memory that you loved?
not a recent release, but you did recommend Gina, which I tracked down a physical copy of and
Oh yeah.
thoroughly enjoyed. I really love Gina. I know I love Gina because there's already a concept. It's ironed into my brain that I'm going to use as shorthand from here on out, and it's just the pool scene is just a confidence building scene. It's one of those scenes where it just demonstrates that like on a technical level and on just like a rhythmic level, the filmmaker knows what they're doing in the way it enraptures you in a way that just it endeared me to the rest of the movie. I trusted it from there on out wherever it went, and I think that's it's really great when a movie does that. Just when they can just show off with the simplest of setups that they know what they're doing.
It's a formally audacious film.
Mhm.
It's like part documentary, more docudrama because the documentarians are actors playing characters in the movie. They are making a documentary about real things from that
Yeah.
region. And that strain of docudrama runs through the the narrative with Gina, the eponymous sex worker of the film, that the movie is essentially this pro labor screed of just like not only is sex work, but anything that you know makes you sweat and is honest work, hard days wages, whatever. Like if you're a worker, you deserve the protections that every worker should be entitled to.
Yeah.
And Gina is a movie about how, because sex workers live on the and operate and work on the margins of society, Gina she is not afforded the same protections that union laborers and all laborers should be entitled to. And so by the end of the film, when she is wronged in her workplace, she takes fucking matters into her own hands. And she calls in some heavy hitters. It's a great fucking movie. It's a movie that, especially for its era and its sort of provenance, that there's so many exploitation films from that era that are very, very lurid in ways that are like they're the camera is also like treating the women the
Right.
way that characters are treating the women. This is a movie that does not fall into that trap. That very clearly Denis Arcand, the filmmaker, he's very intentional about how he approaches the material, and there is never a moment in the film that judges Gina for her profession. Um, and in fact, like I said, the movie is constantly like driving home the point that like no, sex work is work, and these fuckers stepped on the wrong side, or they crossed the line, and she deserves to have some remuneration for that. It's such an incredible movie, and an overlooked one. The
Yeah.
filmmaker Denis Arcand, he also did a movie called Jesus of Montreal, and the Barbarian Invasions. Those are a little bit better known. Jesus of Montreal is a really interesting one. I'm curious what you would think about that.
Have not heard of
It also has some metatextual stuff. It's about like a community theater group who is preparing a passion play, but there are aspects of it that are somewhat heretical, and having to contend with how the community is responding to the, you know, sort of suggestion of sacrilege or heresy. It's a really, really good movie, but Gina, for my money, is his best film.
Yeah.
Highly, highly recommend it, folks, if you can find it.
And bringing up, Gina as a sex worker being out of like, the legal protections of what labor's entitled. It's great how the documentary team within the story is running parallel to her to showcase that like even licensed in doing things by the proper channels, you still have to steal. You still have to sneak around. You still have to kind of fudge the lines as far as asking permission and getting the shot goes. So, on paper, sure, there's this line where, citizens within this line are protected by these legal boundaries. Citizens outside of it aren't. But even the ones within the line, like, they still have to deal with bullshit.
Yeah, it fucking rules. And if we haven't sold you enough on this movie already, it ends with cinema's greatest snowmobile chase. It's so fucking good. Yeah, Gina, that movie whips. I will say on the sort of light exploitation note, I just watched The Licorice Quartet, directed by Radley Metzger.
What is that?
Who did like the opening of Misty Beethoven and Camille 2000. Really, really good filmmaker who worked in porn, but also worked in kind of softcore, the more erotic art house mode back in the day. And I wrote about this on Letterboxd. The Licorice Quartet, which I think you can rent on Amazon for like $3. It's a movie that is so confidently directed and is so inventive and so well staged. This kind of maybe is a good place to end for this conversation, because to me, I'm watching this movie. Not only was I humbled as a filmmaker watching this, but I think it's a grim reflection of where the art form is today, that Radley Metzger, who was working on the margins of the film industry back in the 70s, was doing better, more visually inventive work than, half the filmmakers working today, at least in the studio mode. Now, granted, that may not be that big of a statement, just because I think to some degree, we talked about this last week with David Lynch, that, artistic or aesthetic risks are always kind of happening more on the margins, and then they get sort of pulled into the mainstream and they get appropriated that way, or are kind of laundered in a way. But this is a film that is not necessarily like, he's not out to invent a new visual language. He's just using the camera really, really well and really expressively to illustrate the dynamics, the constantly shifting dynamics between the characters within the film. And it's interesting and sexy and transgressive in a way that so few films are today. So I highly, highly recommend The Licorice Quartet. Really, really fucking good. And I haven't had a lot of time to watch a lot of movies lately. That's the worst part about making movies, is that you don't get to watch as many as you want to. But it was truly a humbling experience to watch it, because like I'm so grateful to have had the privilege to make another movie this year. But as always, I come away from it feeling like, did I learn? Did I grow? Am I getting better? Or am I stagnating? You always want to keep challenging yourself. And certainly watching The Licorice Quartet, I was like, man, here's a guy who was working with, far fewer resources than some of us have at our disposal. And he's still just fucking running circles around not only his contemporaries, but so many modern filmmakers as well. So highly recommend that, as well as a lot of other Radley Metzger's work. I know that some folks aren't down with watching porn or erotic films, but if you're cool with that kind of material, he's a filmmaker who was always bringing something interesting to what he was doing behind the camera. And I highly recommend his work, both skin flicks and his slightly more mainstream stuff.
I do find sex work as a subject of like cinematic and just general narratives worth exploring, because I don't know, it's the interesting intersection of where we're really putting to test like how free does our culture believe people should be versus like how like at what point do other people's bodies start getting policed, and what does that say as far as like what the individual can do in a society and what society wants out of the individual. At least that's why I've always been drawn to it, I think, as far as its depiction in media.
Well, there you go. That's the perfect place to end. Show me the meaning. Watch more pornography.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there's yeah, why not? Hey,
You can get
um,
real flexible with the definition. You know what? If Citizen Kane gets you going, it's pornography.
yeah,
Yeah.
hey, what's Webster's dictionary defines? So, yeah, let's put a button on it. I don't know if the show's ever going to come back. I do know that Austin and I are going to keep on grinding through Scorsese over there on Cinemathology.
Cinematology.
Not quite as regularly since we don't have the same support team over there.
Right.
We got to have you on for a Scorsese
Yeah,
conversation,
I'll
Henry.
definitely be around.
We'll,
I
we'll
know
keep
I'm.
chopping it up.
Yeah, I'll definitely be around. I know, like Burns and the Wisecrack crew. We, there's several streams and ideas floating around. I'll be staying within that circle. I also do want to shout out Techno Poverty. It is a thing I'm starting. It is a stream I'm starting where I play. It's not film related because I can't just stream movies and talk about them, but it is where a friend of mine, a friend and myself are going through video games, talking about related books. It's kind of an exploration of the humanities and just the intertextuality of electronic art with printed art. But I just want to shout that out. So once this show stops, you can still find me there if you care about any kind of waxing on art coming out of my mouth.
Well, like I said, you can find both me and Austin over at Cinemathology. You can email that show, cinemathologypod@gmail.com. If you want to chat movies with us, we're always down to dig through that mailbox a little bit. You can follow me on Letterboxd if you want. I'm at
Yeah.
Crematoria. If you want to keep up to date with me after Show Me the Meaning goes dark in a few minutes. And also, I don't know, I may not have a podcast to plug it on by then, but be on the lookout for Goody Goody coming to Shudder
Ooh.
probably near the end of the year. We're not 100% sure yet, but it's on IMDb there. If you look me up, I try not to talk too much about film as work, because I think it, maybe is a little audacious when we're talking about the great films and the great filmmakers on here. But I will just say, like, it was the privilege of my life to be able to make a movie with somebody else's money.
Yeah,
To be
the
able to
dream.
make a movie, yeah, with some resources at my disposal, and also to make a movie with such an extraordinary cast. I really, I really just am incredibly grateful for the experiences that I've had over this year, not only making movies, but also talking about them with such great folks as yourself and Austin, Michael Burns, and of course, our producer, Matt Keebler, who's always helping out
Yes.
behind the scenes. You guys made this return trip such a treat, and also we gotta end as always with a thank you to the fans.
Yeah.
The powers that be may not see a lot of value in this, but we know that all of you do see some value in this, and we certainly see a lot of value in the relationships that we forge through the chat and through the emails and the constant chatter. It really is it's a cool community, and whatever it's worth, I don't know, exchange contact information out there in the chat, keep in touch,
Yeah, chat's
make
asking,
your own little film club.
they're asking in the chat, where can they find Cinemathology?
You can download Cinemathology on any podcatcher or podcast app. If you look up Cinemathology, CINE mythology. We've been off air for a while, basically since we came back to Show Me the Meaning. It was sort of the 1-2 punch of doing this show and also having to prep for the movie. you know, like I said, I produce Cinemathology, and I'm kind of a one-man band in terms of like editing and doing all the behind-the-scenes stuff. So that sort of as a hobby kind of has to take a back seat to everything else. But yeah, Austin and I love doing it. We obviously love cutting it up, talking about movies. So we'll eventually, we're about halfway through Scorsese. We'll eventually make it through the other half. But you know, you can catch up on the back catalog in the meantime if you check out Cinemathology on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen.
Yeah. Thanks to all the viewers who stayed with us through this extended session as well. I went ahead and I shared some links to both the SMTM Pod Letterboxd profile, which will get you to Raymond, it'll get you to Austin, get you some good friends of the show like Mallory. I am following Mallory on Letterboxd.
Oh yeah, Mallory's one of the great Letterboxd followers.
Yes.
Give her a shout there. And she's also a regular over on Cinemathology. So we have our own little community, our podcasting community here.
I am happy I was able to witness the I saw the TV Glow talk. I think that was one of that was one of my favorite parts of this podcast, of just doing this whole stint with you.
Yeah, not only my favorite film of last year, but probably maybe my favorite episode of this sort of return to the show. I really loved talking about that with Mallory, and also just having an opportunity to wax poetic about what I think is like a major fucking work of this decade in film, and I'm kind of interested to see how time treats that film. I think it'll be kind to it.
Mallory was also great on the Zone of Interest episode. I was not around for, but I did watch.
Yeah. God, another great episode. God, you know what? That Mallory Blair, she knows a thing or two.
Yeah, she does.
So, yeah, are any other guests that we like? Who else should we talk about? We got to give anyone else their flowers.
I think
Amanda Shurker.
That Michael Burns guy.
Great episode. Yeah, Michael Burns. Well,
we did shout out Michael. The hypernormalization episode did get views. So
you know what? I still haven't seen Hypernormalization. I need to watch that so I can listen, so I can catch up with that episode. But Michael is such a mensch. I love the whole Wisecrack family, and it's always a shame when we kind of get pushed our separate ways by the hires up. But
the big wigs.
They can kill Show Me the Meaning, but they can't kill cinema. So enjoy a movie today. Lord knows in these dark times you could do a lot worse. And be sure to keep in touch, reach out. We're always happy to talk movies. So until next time, maybe we see you again, maybe we don't. Whatever it's worth, this was a beautiful journey, and I'm really glad to have joined you on it, Henry.
Yeah, I'm glad to have met you and had these discussions over both Wisecrack Live and Show Me the Meaning. I've enjoyed your insights, and Raymond, it has been an honor. Yeah.
Well, let's wrap it up. It's always tough to say goodbye, but we have to. Peace, everybody. Viva la cinema.
See y'all at the movies. Bye.